What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold onto some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments. The last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, and then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There is a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. As most will remember from high school history and even middle school social studies, Louisiana Territory was bought by Thomas Jefferson from the French Emperor Napoleon because Napoleon needed the money after losing in Haiti. It doubled the size of the U.S. and the U.S. became a major power partly because of this. What many Americans don't know is that Louisiana Territory was once Spain's. For almost 40 years, Spain had legal title, formal recognition, and control over some areas of Louisiana Territory. The territory stretched from New Orleans all the way to the border of what is today Canada, including today's U.S. states of Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. As you can see from the map, this meant that Spain claimed everything west of the Mississippi River, meaning all of the western part of what is today the U.S., more than half of it. La Louisiana, as Spain called it, was almost entirely native tribes who were not really under Spanish control or French before or after the Spaniards, or U.S. control for more than 70 years. Louisiana's European population was mostly French, and even official government business was still often in French. Several thousand Spaniards did come to Louisiana, almost all to New Orleans. St. Louis was founded, but by French traders. Then in 1800, Spain gave it to France in exchange for small bits of land in Italy, and France sold it to the U.S. only 3 years later. What if the territory stays Spanish? France wanted it for supplies for Caribbean plantations. Spain wanted to avoid war with the U.S. since it was weak and in debt after first fighting France and then allying with France against most of the other powers of Europe. Obviously, one way it could stay Spanish is if Spain avoids allying with France or avoids its earlier war with France. But to survive any war or invasion by Americans, Spain would need more colonists in Louisiana. It would need Spanish traders, or those willing to work with French traders, who in turn worked with natives. The main French trade was in furs. Add to that a trade in buffalo robes. Another possibility is an early gold rush to what is today Colorado. We want to avoid a gold rush to the Black Hills, since the Black Hills is a native sacred site. And this gold rush in Colorado was not in the center of Colorado, but close to its present border with Kansas. If there was no Louisiana Purchase, there is no Lewis and Clark. The U.S. stops at the Mississippi River. There is no would-be Republic of Texas. The U.S.-Mexico War is different, or it doesn't happen at all. Louisiana Territory could also receive Métis people from Canada, or runaway slaves from the U.S. That last one almost guarantees war with the U.S. But runaway slaves defeated the U.S. in Florida several times before Spain finally gave in and lost Florida. If Spain never fought or allied with France, it is far less weak. When the independence movements began in Latin America, there is no reason Louisiana Territory would not be either a new independent nation or part of Mexico. Great distances and a large French population make independence likely. In 1800, Louisiana had somewhere between 40 to 50,000 Europeans, plus equal numbers of black slaves or free blacks, plus at least twice that many natives, perhaps 4 times as many. But if many more Spaniards came for trade and gold, the numbers change. A little under 2 million Spaniards immigrated to Latin America in about 340 years before independence. In 40 years, and to one territory only, the most one could expect would be 10% of that, under 200,000. 100,000 Americans came for the Colorado Gold Rush. 300,000 came from the California Gold Rush. At most, Louisiana Territory has 600,000 people against over 5 million Americans in 1800. It seems very likely the War of 1812 will still happen. Americans may be foolish enough to war with Spain and Britain at the same time, and instead of just seizing Spanish Florida, also want to seize the Mississippi River Valley. The War of 1812 was a disaster for the U.S., and even Washington, D.C. was burned down. The most the U.S. might get from this version of the war is the right to travel on the Mississippi River. The U.S. losing in the War of 1812, or even an earlier one, as early as 1802, means a much earlier U.S. Civil War. There are only 10 U.S. slave states and 14 free ones. There will be serious efforts to end slavery by the 1830s, meaning again the U.S. will be too occupied to threaten La Louisiana for decades more. Louisiana would benefit from a U.S. Civil War by trading with both the U.S. and any would-be Confederate nation. If slave states break away, Louisiana again benefits by trade. If they are crushed, which is much more likely since they have not had an extra 30 years to prepare for secession, both militarily and psychologically, the lack of more of a drive for slave states makes the U.S. less likely to invade. Louisiana would today most likely be an independent nation with Spanish and French widely spoken. Most of its perhaps 35 million people are mixed, with large numbers of natives and blacks. Latin America then extends all the way to Canada and to the Mississippi River. The U.S. is far less powerful, with perhaps a third fewer people. From California to Texas remains Mexico. California Indian genocide never happens. That gold rush strengthened Mexico. And if Louisiana had stayed part of Mexico, then it is a far larger nation than the U.S. and perhaps more population and power. This is the end of the 6th video. I look forward to your comments and questions. We'll answer as soon as I can. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if Bolivar unites Gran Colombia.